Good morning. We have a wonderful panel for you now on inclusive education. Your program indicates inclusive higher education, but we've expanded it a little bit. We're also going to change the format a little bit. We will begin with Gopal Mitra from UNICEF, and all the biographies are in your books, and so I won't spend time elaborating on them, but we'll begin with Gopal, who works with UNICEF and specializes in refugee children and other children in areas of post-conflict and at risk. We'll then move along the timeline to Andy Imparato, and Andy is with the Association of University Centers on Disabilities, although I still remember you from AAPD and the EOC, etc. And Andy will talk about college and university level. And then we'll move on to Iezzoni, who's been one of the pioneering women and persons with disabilities in the medical school and medical profession, and whose research often looks at the role of caregivers and medical professionals with disabilities. Following their talks of 15 minutes each, we will open up the forum for questions because you've been very patient. And what we'd like to do is take several short questions, not elaborations or comments, but short questions from you, 2, 3, 4, something like that. And we'll have the panel members respond to whatever various aspects of those questions they feel suitable. So thank you for joining us. We decided to aim this panel on education because typically when you work with disabled people's organizations and policymakers, when we think about what it means to have citizenship, they talk about education and education as an opportunity, and that is not unique to the disability community. Those of us who are children of immigrants surely heard that the rest of our lives. And the great Judith Sklar, who wrote about citizenship, said it had to do with education, employment, and voting. So we're focusing on education. And as we go down the timeline, beginning with Gopal, over to Andy, over to Lisa, we can imagine that if you are a child with a disability growing up somewhere in the world, these are stops along the line. And in each one of these stops, there's a fork in the road. And one fork leads to empowerment and opportunities and greater social inclusion. And the other fork leads to exclusion, marginalization, and often poverty and being left out. And having worked in 40-something countries, which sounds impressive until you realize how many Judy and Charlotte have worked in, I will tell you that the same rationales that are put forward by school principals, ministries of education, teachers, parents of children without disabilities, adults and university students without disabilities, for why those with disabilities ought not to be included, get repeated over and over again. And if you could visually imagine this, it's almost like seeing a film with the same script, but the faces and the languages change. But the words are all the same. It wouldn't be fair to those individuals. We don't have the expertise to include them. Disability accommodations, as opposed to any others, cost money, and we don't have those resources. Or sometimes more affirmatively, as in, we've tried to disable people, it didn't work. Or we already have 2 blind students, go somewhere else, how many do we have to take? That actually was told to me by a college in the Philippines. So experientially, we see that, and I hear the same things over and over again. Personally, it's an area that I feel very akin to and that I work very strongly in for the reason that I have very clear recollections of what it was like to have been a 14-year-old with a disability returning from 8 months of rehabilitation and being told by my school, well, actually, you're not wanted. We can't accommodate you. The reason being that the building was divided into 2 parts with stairs in the middle, and it wasn't until their chief donor was contacted and called up and told them no more money unless you figure this out, that a light bulb went on, and they said, well, gosh, I guess we could put all the classes on the side of the building without the stairs. And I have a clear recollection of, a guidance counselor coming to our house during the end of high school and telling my parents and myself that I was unsuitable for college work, and therefore I should not apply to colleges, or if I had to, maybe it should be City of New York, or a community college. He also told that to every college I applied to. I also have a clear recollection of what it was like, and we'll get to this in a minute, to be here at the law school and be told that they were actually not going to provide accommodations to basic needs. And I also have a very clear recollection of what it was like to do a PhD in a much older place, Cambridge University, where my college, Gonville and Keys, bent over backwards to make me feel included and part of the process. I lived in college when no other graduate student did. They changed their 800-year-old charter. I continued to live in college as a married person, although there were no other married people in college, because they thought it would be a good thing for me to remain there. They had some background having had this guy named Stephen Hawking. But still, the lesson to be drawn from it is institutions can be welcoming and inclusive, or they can be excluding and rather off-putting. But to end before our speakers on a very positive note, things change. Things change. And so, I have a clear recollection again of coming up to interview, having been offered a place at Harvard Law School and also at that place, further south, and meeting with the dean of students and being told, well, there is one room you could have for 3 years. It's the only dorm room that actually has a ramp leading up into it. But there's no kitchen for you to use, and there's no laundry for you to access, and we're not going to change the bathrooms. We will give you a wooden seat, one of those big old wooden seats, to sit on in the shower. Do you know what it's like sitting on a wooden seat that's been exposed to water? Okay. Now you get it. And during the winter, there are tunnels underneath the law school so that our students can be warm and safe and dry, but there's no elevator access to them. So you'll go above ground through the snow and ice, barefoot, backwards, uphill, all that sort of stuff. And I said, well, that's not very welcoming, is it? And they told me that 4-letter word you never use on this campus. If you don't like it, you can go to Yale. But I didn't. I stayed here because, hearkening back to one of Judy's remarks, you need to be present. And you need to let them see that you're here and that you're not going to disappear. And during that time, I broke the barrier. I became the first person with a known disability to have been on the Harvard Law Review, year 100. 100 years. So, but fast forward now. Fast forward 15 years, and I've come back on the other side of the ledger as a teacher. And I'm teaching disability law in a room with about 55 students. And behind me, outside the room, it's in Hauser, if you want to go look, is a painting of Oliver Wendell Holmes, our allegedly greatest Supreme Court justice, who upheld involuntary sterilization for people with disabilities on the ground of 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And I'm opening up this class by talking to my students about where we've come from, where we're going, and I tell them about what it was like back in the old days, right, when I went to law school. And they're sitting there, and they're looking at me as if I have 3 heads. Because these are students who grew up with an ADA, with an Americans with Disabilities Act. And they grew up, thanks to these folks, with an Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And they've had people with disabilities around them in schools and on buses and in movie theaters and in restaurants. And they think it's absolutely bizarre that anyone would be excluded to that extent. And that is wonderful and beautiful. So we should remember that things change in time. Our first speaker, Gopal Mitra from UNICEF, will speak about more of the K-12 area and about children with disabilities who are refugees and in areas of risk. Gopal Da.
Thank you, Michael Da. First of all, it's great to be here today, and I was listening to the discussions in the morning, and I was just thinking to myself that the breadth and depth of the discussions that we have had, I wonder if it would have been of this depth and breadth even 5 or 10 years back. What we need to acknowledge, and I think we are doing it, is that we have come a long way. We need to go a long way, but we have come a long way, and it's important to have that feeling and acknowledge and tell ourselves that change is possible, and we are making it, and we are going to make more of it. A couple of years back, a young girl in Uganda told me that, hey, give me good education and be rest assured, I will ensure my inclusion and participation in the community. So that's what, and that girl also happened to be a refugee. So that's what children and young people feel. The issue of citizenship and disability is wide-ranging, and I'll focus on children with disabilities, linking it to citizenship primarily from the point of view of connectedness, a sense of belonging, participating in the community, and equal opportunities, which is essential to realize one's potential. Let me start with two general comments. I often hear people saying that the children are the future. To me, children are not only the future, they are very much the present. It's not a cliche, but it's important to understand this because it's then you get into your DNA slowly and slowly that of the centrality of the agency and autonomy of children. And it has a direct bearing to participate in, to citizenship, to everything that we talk about. So children with disabilities are very much the present. The second general point that I want to make is children with disabilities are first and foremost children. And the majority, and have the same rights as any other child. And a majority, if you see a majority of their needs are the same as any other child. A safe and empowering environment, access to education, health services and health care, safe drinking water, etc., etc. Some needs are specific, like access to assistive technology, rehabilitation, and so on. When I tell this to people, they say, oh, it's common sense, you know. But I have seen so many instances, and one of my favorite examples is after the tsunami in India in 2005, I was doing some work, post-disaster work, and we go to a house where there is a young girl who had difficulty in walking and used a wheelchair. And I asked her, after the tsunami, what happened to you? Did someone ask you about what you needed? She said, you know something? Immediately after the tsunami, there were 5 relief agencies. They came to me, and they all gave me 1 wheelchair each. So I had 5 wheelchairs. But no one asked me that, do I want to go to the school that has just reopened? No one asked. So, I mean, when we see children with disabilities, we have to understand that they are first and foremost children, and the disability-specific needs are only a part of the whole puzzle. Having said that, over the last 10 years, as Charlotte has mentioned, we have seen significant changes happening. 178 countries ratifying the CRPD. At the United Nations in 2013, we have had the first high-level meeting on disability. In July this year, in London, we had the first Disability Summit. And not only in disability-specific summits or events, even in mainstream summits like the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, the issue of disability and inclusion of persons with disabilities was one of the highlights. I had never seen so many people with disabilities in a mainstream event. And that after the closing remarks of the summit, the Secretary General of the United Nations remarked that it's in the summit that people with disabilities were center and front. And so we see that things are changing, but the pace needs to be accelerated. There are 1 billion people in this world who have a disability, and we are talking about huge numbers. And if you really want to make a difference, we have to accelerate the pace of this change. Now, if we talk about the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, Charlotte mentioned, for the first time, there are explicit and specific references to persons with disabilities. Let me go to Goal 4 of the SDGs. It talks about inclusive quality education and lifelong learning for all. It does not mention almost all, right? So if you really want to achieve the SDGs and Goal 4, you cannot do it without including full access to quality education as far as children with disabilities are concerned. The latest data shows that globally more than half the children with disabilities do not go to school. In many countries, the rate is high as 90%. In situations of disasters, emergencies, armed conflict, the numbers of children who do not access education is staggering. At the same time, we see that countries are increasingly enacting laws, policies, revising policies, enacting new ones. If you see the reporting of the governments, of the state parties to the CRPD, to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, you see that around 70% of countries have inclusive education as a principle in their policy. We have data that shows that if you do not include children with disabilities in school, in education, 1 to 5% of GDP could be lost due to lost potential income. We know that the SDGs cannot be achieved if children with disabilities do not go to school. And we know, given the numbers, that inclusive education is the only way that millions of children with disabilities who are not in school can be provided education. So inclusive education is not only a good thing to do from a normative point of view, it's the smartest thing to do. So while on one hand, we see a whole range of policies being enacted by countries. I was in Kenya in May, where they launched the integrated education multi-sectoral policy. Very, very progressive, very strong. But what we see is there is a gap between the policy intent and the capacity of education systems to deliver inclusive education. And yes, we do mind the gap. So the question is, how do we close this gap? How do we operationalize inclusive education? There are a range of actions being taken, and there are a range of areas which require urgent action. The need for data and evidence on children with disabilities, the need of flexible curriculum, the need of building capacity, the capacity of the system, of human resources, particularly teachers, accessibility, reasonable accommodation, assistive technology, and a host of others. Let me focus on 3 of these issues. First of all, let me reflect briefly on the need for data. For children with disabilities to count, they have to be counted. And believe me, we have much less idea in low and middle income countries than we need to formulate robust policies. We need to know how many children with disabilities are there, how many of them are in school, how they are faring in school, what is their learning outcomes as compared to children without disabilities, and so on. We do not have the data. That's the bad news. But the good news is that we now have robust tools which would enable us to measure the same, to track the same, so that policies, allocation of resources can be informed by that data. Many countries have now started implementing the standardized tools, data collection modules, which will not only help nationally, but will also help us to gather comparable data which will help us to measure progress globally. So there's a lot of good work happening on that front. The second point I want to highlight is the issue of accessibility. I mean, if you see the OECD data and their estimates, OECD estimates that a global investment of $6.3 trillion annually will be required if we want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Huge number. I don't even know how many zeros there are. Seriously. In 2016, OECD's overseas development assistance comprised $42 billion on social infrastructure, $15 billion of it on health and education. We know that if you plan accessibility from the design stage, it does not cost more than 1%. So another no-brainer. But if we see in practice, while we see that increasingly accessibility is factored in, there's a long way to go, and that's one of the easy and quick wins, easy to measure, which we have to be constantly working on. Let me give you an example, why I'm saying we have to constantly work on it. Last year, we sent a survey to our colleagues, internal, is your office accessible? Some of the responses we got back, and these are colleagues which are well informed, working on development for a long time. Yes, our offices are accessible. We are located downtown. We have 4 bus connections to the office. That is the conception of accessibility to someone outside this room for a majority of people. So a lot of the speakers previously were talking about the need for building awareness, the need for constantly highlighting, even at the cost of being repetitive, of the importance of some of these key issues. And we can't do enough of it. The third point is assistive technology and innovations.
2 minutes, Gopal.
Okay, 2 minutes, okay. 10% of children with disabilities in low-income countries have access to assistive technology. Now, it is, again, a no-brainer. If you want children with disabilities to be in classrooms and to participate and to learn, we need to provide assistive technology. Without that, we cannot operationalize inclusive education. The good thing is that globally we see a lot of efforts that are happening to change this scenario. During the Global Disability Summit, a new global partnership on assistive technology was launched, which aims to provide 500 million people with disabilities with assistive technology by 2030. Big ambition, but we need to have such ambitions if we want to see significant change. I think I have 1 minute. Let me touch on situations of risk. We are facing the largest displacement of people after Second World War. 70 million people around the world face displacement today. And if you apply a figure of 15% of them being disabled, it's a staggering 10 million. Refugees, and especially children with disabilities who are refugees, we have seen policies of host countries do not give them equal access to basic rights such as education. And this needs to change. I was in the Zatari refugee camp last month, and in a school of 2,000 children, one of the amazing things I saw, they had 160 children with disabilities. So there are pockets of good work happening. And one of the children told me, and I'll end with this remark, a young disabled person, a Syrian refugee, he told me that I do not want to miss school. I come to school regularly. I said, why? He said, one day I'm going to go back to my country and I want to be qualified to rebuild my country. That's what young people with disabilities feel, and I think it encompasses a lot of things that we're talking about related to citizenship. So there's a long way to go. We have come a long way. We cannot do it alone, and joint action by everybody in this room and beyond is required to transform these islands of good practices into oceans of good practices so that millions of children with disabilities will have the opportunity to realize their potential. Thank you very much.
Andy?
So first, let me just thank Michael and Sherry and the folks at the Radcliffe Institute for inviting me and for hosting what I think has really been an extraordinary day, and I'm really happy to be here. I started doing disability work in Boston. I don't think it was in my official bio, but I worked at the Disability Law Center here in Boston at the beginning of my career, and I just wanted to start by acknowledging some of the local disability leaders who were important mentors for me as a young lawyer with bipolar disorder who was dealing with a new diagnosis, and were very encouraging of me to be out with my disability, including people like Bill Henning, who at the time was at the Cape Organization for the Rights of the Disabled, and Paul Spooner, a really important national leader in the independent living movement, Judy Chamberlain, who had been one of the most important leaders at the time they were calling the psychiatric survivor movement, advocating for human rights for people with psychiatric disabilities. And then after I came to Washington, I had more mentors from Massachusetts like Christine Griffin and Fred Fay and Charlie Carr, or Charlie Ka, as he says. I feel like this is where I got started. I know a lot of people see Berkeley as the home of the disability rights movement, but for me it's Boston, and I'm very grateful.
Number 2 in terms of our CIL.
Yes. And I'm very grateful to have been exposed to a way of thinking about disability at a time where I was dealing with disability that affected my energy and my self-esteem, and it really helped me to be around people that could model for me how to be a proud out person with a non-visible disability, what that looked like. So now I've been in Washington for 25 years, for better or for worse. I'm delighted to be at the Association of University Centers on Disabilities, which is a national network of federally funded centers for excellence in disabilities. We have at least one in every state and territory. The leaders from one of the 2 centers in Boston are here today. Tom Santacandro is the director of the Institute for Community Inclusion, which is one of our biggest university centers for excellence in the country. Tom is kind of a model for citizenship, so I want to brag on him for a minute. Tom was a special education lawyer, had a child with a developmental disability, became a state legislator, got a PhD at Brandeis while he was a state legislator, decided he wanted to do something else, and now he's in academia, but he really kind of comes at disability and policy from a number of different perspectives, and I feel like we need more of that. We need more people with lived experience who are willing to go into public service and move around within service to try to elevate these issues. And then the last thing that I just wanted to say is because I represent a network of folks who operate in higher education settings, a lot of people don't really know what we do. They think we represent the Disabled Student Services offices on campuses, which we don't. Think of us as like mini think tanks. If you add all their budgets together, it's a $650 million network, and I think of it as a $650 million research and development arm for the disability field, where one of the things that we develop is people. So we train professionals, we train family leaders, we train self-advocate leaders, and that's kind of, I think, an important way to keep the values of the disability movement fresh and to have a kind of a constant effort to expose a new generation of leaders to those values. And part of those values really do relate to citizenship. So because we were asked to talk about higher education, disability, and citizenship, I thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about the purpose of higher education. And this is something that I think is being debated a lot right now. Higher education is changing. And I was a humanities major in college, and I specialized in Italian Renaissance culture. The president of my college, Bart Giamatti, encouraged us in freshman year to find something that we loved and study it and not worry about how we were going to use it after we graduated. And I took that seriously. I fell in love. I fell in love with the period 1506 to 1526 in Rome. So I'm jealous that Charlotte got to go to Rome. But I think there are people in higher education that are trying to make the case for liberal arts and for people studying things that don't necessarily directly translate into a job or a career. And there's a woman at the Association of American Colleges and Universities named Bethany Zucker Sutton, who is leading an effort for them called Liberal Education and America's Promise. And as I understand it, part of the effort is to help make the case for liberal arts education in an era where higher education is very expensive and where it's changing. And she said in a piece that she wrote in June of 2016, the piece is called Higher Education's Public Purpose. She said the larger purpose of higher education beyond preparation for employment is to connect students with real-world problems and getting them engaged in creative and collaborative problem solving. And I think if you think about a lot of the issues that we've talked about today, these are real-world problems that will be faced by every country in the world for the rest of our lives and beyond. And we have an opportunity, while people are getting their higher education, to expose them to these problems and to give them skills that will help them address some of these problems. And they will be exposed in a much deeper way if they have students, faculty, and staff on their campuses who are visible and proud people with disabilities. So I think there's a direct connection between the mission of higher education and the imperative to have people with disabilities represented in every constituency on a campus, including the alumni and the donors. Another thing that she talked about in her article that I thought was thought-provoking, she talked about key skills or learning outcomes that are important for people to develop as part of higher education. And in the list, she included critical thinking, problem solving, working with diverse teams, ethical reasoning, and communicating. And that if you have these skills, you're not just going to be a good employee, but you're going to be a good citizen. And I think if you go back to the founding of our country, some of our founders were very concerned about what kind of citizens we were going to mold as a country, and we left out huge populations when we were thinking about our citizenry. And then our country, in an iterative process, has tried to bring more and more people into citizenships, but it's not a linear process. And as was mentioned on the earlier panel, we're living through an era right now in the US and around the world where people are getting defined out of citizenship, getting defined out of the in-groups, and there is a need for us to be vigilant and be clear about what are our core values, and one of the ways we develop those core values is in higher education. So I believe that higher education is the solution to some of the problems that we're facing as a world, but it won't be an effective solution if it's not inclusive. And the word inclusive in a higher education context has come to mean a lot of different things. But one thing that we haven't talked a lot about yet, so I wanted to bring it up, is including students with intellectual disabilities in higher education. And this is something that our center at UMass Boston has been a national leader on. They have a website called Think College, which is really about opening up higher education opportunities for populations of students that historically have not had much access to higher education, certainly outside of a community college context. And I'll never forget it. I've been traveling around the country visiting our centers, and when I visited the center at the University of Arizona, which has probably one of the best, if not the best, disabled student services offices in the country, the person who ran that office was uncomfortable with opening up higher ed at the University of Arizona to students with intellectual disabilities. And she was a woman with a physical disability who had been a very important leader in the disability movement and in inclusive higher ed more broadly, but not including students with intellectual disabilities. And her perspective was, if people don't have the skills to get into this university, why would we create a program for them? That was a hard thing for her to wrap her head around. And I think she was not, in some ways she was testing me. It wasn't like a firm position, but I do think that's one of our challenges. You think about Harvard, as kind of an epitome, elite institution within higher ed. Is Harvard ready to have, a law professor with an intellectual disability? Is Harvard ready to have a fellow here at the Radcliffe Institute with an intellectual disability? And if not, why? And I guess what I'm finding at AUCD, I'm working more closely with the leaders of the intellectual disability community than I have in other positions. What I'm finding is very often working alongside somebody with an intellectual disability is going to give you skills, or teaching in a classroom with somebody with an intellectual disability is going to give you skills that will enable you to reach a much broader population independent of disability status. Recently, on the hearing, we talked about the Supreme Court earlier, the hearing for the confirmation of Judge Kavanaugh, one of the witnesses that was selected by Senator Feinstein was a woman with an intellectual disability, Liz Weintraub, who I think was the most compelling witness in the Kavanaugh hearing. And I'll give you an example of why she was the most compelling witness. When her panel was done, Senator Feinstein commended her, which was not surprising, and then Senator Ted Cruz commended her for her testimony. And for those of you that don't follow this closely, Ted Cruz was not a fan of her message, but he was impressed with her as a messenger. And he was impressed with her broader message. He just didn't like the part about not confirming Judge Kavanaugh. But why did Liz testify? Why was she selected? This was not an accident. This was not an easy thing to happen. She was selected because Judge Kavanaugh, as a DC Circuit judge, had written an opinion that said that women with intellectual disabilities who were under the care of the District of Columbia could have health care decisions made about their lives without them being consulted, and that did not raise concerns for the panel. He was writing on behalf of a panel. And when Liz became aware of this case, she decided that she needed to be focused on trying to stop him from coming onto the Supreme Court. I firmly believe that we could have had experts on intellectual disabilities. We could have had law professors who were experts on the history of how people with intellectual disabilities have been treated by the Supreme Court, including Buck versus Bell, the case that was referenced by Michael. But I think in this case, it was more compelling to hear from a 53-year-old woman with an intellectual disability who could talk about what it's like to have other people make decisions for you, and her own experience with that. And that's really, to me, the job of a witness, is to break through the noise and try to reach the senators in a way that could change the way they think about an issue. And I feel like Liz had a huge impact with her testimony. And on this issue, which is much bigger than Judge Kavanaugh, the issue of self-determination for people with intellectual disabilities is much bigger than Judge Kavanaugh. One of the things that I learned yesterday when I visited our center in Boston, how am I doing on time? 2, okay. One of the things am I supposed to be looking at something? I don't see that.
There's a clock up there.
Where is it? Oh, there it is, I see it. One of the things that I learned is that one of the best outcomes for students with intellectual disabilities who experience inclusive higher education is improvements in their own self-determination. So if they spend time on a campus with their peers, with and without disabilities, and they see what self-determination looks like for a 20-year-old on a college campus, they're more likely to exercise self-determination when they're not on that campus. And I think that's a very interesting thing for us to think about. There's definitely a benefit to the other students. At Vanderbilt, they have a program called Next Steps, where there are 6 undergrads without disabilities who are supporting the undergrads with intellectual disabilities, and many of them say that was one of the most important positive experiences they had as a Vanderbilt student, was participating in that program and learning how to support a peer with an intellectual disability. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity for us to kind of redefine the higher education space, redefine what an elite institution means in the 21st century, redefine the mission, or kind of get back to the original mission of higher education. I think one of our challenges is the way we think about accessibility and accommodations. On most campuses, the Disabled Student Services Office is not an empowered office. The person who runs that office typically does not have a lot of clout. They're not a tenured faculty member who tend to be the people that matter the most on a college campus. So I think it's really worth thinking about reimagining how we create accessibility and universal design and inclusion on college campuses. And I believe one of the things we need to do is start thinking about disability cultural centers on campuses and not about disabled student services, and having the services be embedded in a much broader and richer tapestry of academic mission and other things that are going on, the arts, sports, all the different ways that people with disabilities can interact with a college campus. So I'm out of time. I'm looking forward to the questions, but I do want to just close with a quote from Martin Luther King that I think is very relevant for today and the period we're living through, and I think it's a good challenge as we think about the future of higher ed. He said that human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable, that even a superficial look at history reveals that no social advance rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. He said, every step towards the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle, the tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. And I apologize to the interpreters. Without persistent effort, this part is so relevant for today. Without persistent effort, time itself becomes an ally of the insurgent and primitive forces of irrational emotionalism and social destruction. He said, this is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This has been an amazing session, and I am the last person, which is the unenviable position. I've been asked to speak about medical education, and I want to start with the good news, and the good news starts with Sherry. Sherry. When I first met Sherry, I was just stunned by her kind of composure and self-confidence, and I said, Sherry, did you ever think that there was an impediment to you becoming a doctor? And she said, no. And I was like, whoa. Because when I started Harvard Medical School, September 8th, 1980, I'd had 4 years of shadowy on-again, off-again symptoms that turned out, as I learned during my first semester at Harvard Medical School, to be multiple sclerosis. I don't have time to go into the details of what it was like for those 4 years. Just assume it wasn't good. And at the end, when I was going to be trying to apply for an internship or residency to become either a primary care doctor or an oncologist, I was told that the medical school, in their wisdom, had decided not to write a letter of recommendation for me to apply for an internship or residency. So even though I completed my MD degree, did all the coursework, all the clerkships, I never was able to go on for the postgraduate training that you need to become a licensed practicing physician, so I never practiced medicine. So the good news is that post-ADA, I don't think that this would happen to another student. I think we're safe there. But the bad news is that people with disabilities are neither represented in the practicing medical profession or in the medical student body the way that they are in the population. So when you speak to people about this, they'll invariably say to me, well, I know so-and-so who's at medical school who has a disability, as if that poster child is supposed to show me that people with disabilities are represented in medical school. Current estimates are shadowy. We don't really know for sure, but we think that about 2.7% of medical students report some sort of disability. And what are the types of disabilities? Meeks and Herser in 2016 did a study that suggests that ADHD is about a third of the disability reported by medical students, learning disability about a fifth, psychological disability about a fifth, chronic health problems about 13%, and then vision, mobility, deaf or hard of hearing about 2 or 3% each. Okay, so I'd like to make 3 points in my talk today. And the first is that medical training is kind of an apprenticeship model. You have these little embryo doctors that are these medical students, and they follow around to the big grown-up doctors, and that's basically how they learn how to become a doctor. Now, all doctors have sworn an oath to benefit patients and to do no harm. So the first question always raised about a person with a disability becoming a doctor is whether they will harm a patient. Now, doctors are also closely regulated by boards of medicine or some other state body, and those require that a doctor be licensed and that these licenses are periodically renewed to continue to practice. The norm is therefore, if you want to avoid losing your license, to not admit any weakness at all, because weaknesses could risk your medical license and your ability to practice. And we know from studies that medical licensure boards do not actually apply the ADA, do not practice in a way that the ADA would comply, that complies with the ADA. And so people are really, truly at threat of losing their medical licenses inappropriately if they admit some sort of weakness. I'm aware of a recent survey, I will not tell you exactly of who, but of about 1,000 Harvard medical faculty about various factors, and about 550 of them responded to this survey, and only a handful said that they had any sort of disability. Now, we know that that's not accurate. We know that more than a handful of those 550 doctors had some sort of disability. Why were they so terrified of admitting it? It was a confidential survey. Why couldn't they respond honestly? Now, we do know that there is some recognition that there are a lot of doctors with disabilities. We know that serious mental illness, for example, is a disabling condition that doctors have much more than the general population. Data released in 2018 showed that doctors have the highest suicide rate of any profession. 28 to 40 per 100,000 doctors per year will commit suicide, compared with 12.3% 12.3 per 100,000 persons in the general population. We know that 28% of doctors in training, residents, experience major depression during their training, compared with a general population rate of about 7 to 8%. But doctors are afraid to admit mental illness. They're afraid to seek treatment. There's tremendous stigmatization about this that persists today, and that I've witnessed among my colleagues in talking about other people with mental illness. Now, remember that earlier I mentioned that one of the leading disability types reported among the 2.7% of medical students who have disability is ADHD and learning disability. Well, obviously, a reasonable accommodation for those students is going to be giving them more time. Critical accommodation, giving them extra time to complete an exam. But for the practicing physician today, if you talk to them, the thing that they do not have is time. They've got time pressures, they've got demands to see more patients, especially in fields like primary care. They have low per visit payments, and so to remain financially viable, they have to see a huge volume of patients. Doctors are burning out at extraordinary rates and leaving the field. Okay, so second point. Medicine is a cognitive field. However, it's got intensely physical aspects to it. Diagnoses are made through looking closely at patients, watching them, listening to their stories, communicating with them. So vision, hearing, and communication are key. Physicians have to physically touch patients. They have a physical intimacy with patients' bodies. They are expected to feel them in private places. So thus, mobility and the sense of touch and manual dexterity are key abilities. Medical schools have long established what are called technical standards, actions and approaches by which students must demonstrate a competency, proficiency to be able to graduate from medical school. So a student with a disability relating to vision, hearing, communication, mobility, hand dexterity, or touch may not be able to meet these technical standards without accommodations. However, the ADA puts limits on what are considered reasonable accommodations. accommodation requests are not considered reasonable if they would fundamentally alter the curriculum, which in medical school includes the technical standards. So there have been court cases that have looked at this, and obviously in the ADA, as always, each individual case is going to be considered separately. There's a lot of kind of individual circumstances. And so there are not any systematic answers from the courts about what constitutes reasonable accommodations for the technical standards. But we do know that, that different medical schools have different technical standards. And there are two main types of technical standards. One are called the organic technical standards, which is where a medical student has to be able to perform all the technical tasks without any accommodations. Even a technical accommodation, they have to do everything organically themselves with their own body as it exists. The other approach is functional technical standards, which focuses on the outcome of being performed a technical task, which could include having accommodation, assistive technology. Suffice it to say that there are changes undergoing in what technical standards should be for medical schools. This is a vigorous debate. And a major question is whether a medical school student is equivalent to a stem cell. In other words, they're a pluripotent cell that is going to differentiate into all different types of doctors, oncologists, hematologists, surgeons, et cetera. Does everybody have to be able to do every single technical task? Obviously, different specialties require different skills. But for the practicing physicians concerned about safety, are also raised for medical students. And so there have been some court cases about whether medical students with disabilities present safety risks to patients. And one recent case found that providing an ASL interpreter to a medical student would not cause safety risk to the patient, as had been claimed by that student's medical school. So the third and final point. This is what my research is actually about, is about healthcare disparities for people with disabilities. And we do know that people with disabilities experience a lot of disparities in the care that they get, although this differs by the type of care and by the type of disability. But we do know that today's doctors are being trained by the very doctors that are out there giving care that is rife with disparities. And so faculty are often unaware of disability disparities and totally uninformed about how to address them. And in addition, medical students may be being trained in settings that are not uniformly accessible to persons with disabilities. While ADA addresses access for persons with disability to physical spaces, it does not address the content of those spaces. So for example, it does not address whether an exam table, a diagnostic imaging machine, a mammogram machine is accessible. You might not know, but in fact, Section 4203 of the Affordable Care Act required that the U.S. Access Board, in combination with the Food and Drug Administration, come up with standards for medical diagnostic equipment, including exam tables, weight scales, and diagnostic imaging technologies. These standards were published in January of 2017, underline that date. The next step was for the Department of Justice to do a scoping review to determine how widely disseminated these accessible technologies had to be available. On December 26th of 2017, the Department of Justice under Jeff Sessions decided not to do the scoping review. And so we currently do not have any standards about how widely available accessible medical technologies need to be. So the final point I want to make is, might having more medical students with disabilities make physicians and students around them more aware of issues relating to disabilities? Might having more medical students with disabilities help chip away at these disability disparities? Now, the answer to both questions might be yes, although there's no empirical evidence to back that speculation. But the way that medical schools work, this could put medical students with disability into an awkward position of having the lowest person in a very rigid hierarchy confront the highest person. So much of medical students' rating by the faculty is subjective. Could this hurt evaluations of medical students and thus hurt their chances for getting into those selective residency training programs? Plus, medical students with one disability type may not necessarily understand the experiences of persons with other disability types. So expecting medical students to be aware across all disability types is unfair and puts too much pressure on them. Plus, it singles out the student with a disability as having different expectations imposed on them than are applied to other students. And so I have 2 minutes and 4 seconds left. And so I'm going to end with a final story, which is not really a story about me. It's actually more a story about the late Dr. Charlie McCabe. Charlie McCabe was about to be, well, he was actually appointed God. I work at the Massachusetts General Hospital, and back in the early 1980s, the Massachusetts General Hospital, which is man's greatest hospital, had appointed Dr. Charlie McCabe to be their chief surgical resident. And that was, at that time, akin to being appointed God. But at that time, Dr. McCabe was suddenly diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and he was unable to go on to be the chief surgical resident. But what he did was he became an emergency room doctor and a teacher and a beloved person at the medical school. He died an earlier death than he should have, but I had, after I'd gotten that statement from my advisor at Harvard Medical School that they weren't going to write a letter for me, I decided to go to ask Charlie McCabe what I should do. Should I push? Should I try as much as I possibly could to try to become a practicing doctor, to get that letter of recommendation out of the medical school? I never talked about what Charlie McCabe's response was until I got permission from him, because it was really a story about him. And I asked him what I didn't know was going to be about 3 weeks before he died. But I asked his permission, and so about 3 weeks before he died, he gave me permission to tell this story. When I asked him, should I push, should I try, should I get them to give me this letter of recommendation, he said, Lisa, if you have anything else you can do in life, try to do something else, because they will never, ever believe that you can be a practicing physician with a disability. And I say that because that's obviously what his experience had been. And so he was telling me that from his experience as somebody who'd been almost appointed God, that he wasn't going to be able to succeed there. So although we've got the ADA that's protecting us, I am not entirely sure that those attitudes have yet gone away in the medical profession. Thank you.
Okay. So we're going to ask our volunteers to get ready with those microphones. Individuals from the audience, we've left you time for short questions. We'd like to take 2, 3, 4, a bunch of them for the panel. Raise your hand or some other way, and we'll get to you.
Okay, so my name is John. I'm a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute, and my work mainly concerns disability, sexuality, reproductive health. I think I'd like to pick on the point about data. I guess one of the starting point about citizenship is actually sort of being counted in the first place. And if you look around a lot of low-income countries, especially in Africa, there's a lot of self-censorship, family censorship, and community-level censorship. So, I mean, it's something I'm trying to think about. How do we, because there are no incentives for families to disclose that they have persons with disabilities. At least in the US, at least the conversation I'm hearing, there are a lot of incentives. You know, there are a lot of benefits. There's a welfare system that people can say, well, there's some incentive to disclose that I have some disability. In a place like Ghana, there's really not much incentives. So my question is, how do we get around this censorship to actually count people in the first place as a starting point? Thank you.
Wonderful. Can we take another couple of short questions? And please, again, introduce yourselves when speaking.
Hello, it's Colin Killick, Deputy Director of Disability Policy Consortium. Thank you all so much. I wanted to come back to something Andy said about the disability cultural centers at universities. I wanted to ask the panel collectively to talk about the connection between treating disability seriously as a subject of academic inquiry and making students with disabilities feel welcome in universities.
Okay, terrific. No? Okay.
Oh, wait, sorry.
Hello, I'm Elizabeth Dean Clower, public health physician. Thank you to Michael and Sherry Blowett for this excellent conference we've had today. My concern, based on what we both heard in the morning and certainly on your panel, is given that we have champions of disability policy, the need for studies, that the absence of a recognized curriculum at the Harvard Kennedy School sends a very different message, since the Kennedy School is known for its excellence or promoting excellence and leadership in this country and around the world. And I'm concerned about the message that sends. I know that Professor Stein has a course there, but that otherwise students who have this interest need to seek it out at the other graduate schools. And so that's not only a concern, but how do you see that changing? Or are there other universities that do have a model that recognizes the need for leadership in this field?
Okay, terrific. And can we take one more and then let the panel respond?
Hi, my name is Melanie McLaughlin. I am a teaching fellow at the Ed School with Dr. Hare, and I'm a parent of a fourth grader, 10-year-old with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Thank you all for the conference today. It was very, very informative. And one of the most important things I think I'm walking away with today is the idea of disability identity. And I have a fourth grader that I really need to empower and to teach disability identity. And I'm looking to where we do that in our American school system and in our educational system, because that's not what we're experiencing on the ground floor of our school systems across the country. And so giving us the tools for empowerment for our children so that we are raising a next generation of leaders, I think is very important. How can we do that?
You're also a great filmmaker, so thank you. Lisa, can we start with you? Any or all of?
You know something? I feel like from my perspective, I have so little to add because, as I've kind of said, the medical school training is just so different. So the only thing I would say to Colin about being welcoming to students is that you actually have accessible equipment in the places where you have to do your standardized patient training, so that if you actually have a student with a disability, that they can actually do the kind of physical exam on that student. That wasn't necessarily the case at Harvard Medical School until fairly recently.
So I'll take a couple. Gopal, I assume you're going to talk about data, and sure, I can chime in if necessary. But I guess I want to focus on Harvard for a minute, because there were different questions related to the Kennedy School and other aspects. To the extent that Harvard wants to be the best in the world or the best in the United States, I think Harvard has to decide that being the best in disability studies and being the best in preparing people for a world where a fifth of the population experiences a disability is a decision that has to get made at a very leadership level, and it needs to have resources behind it. And if you're looking kind of for a model, there are plenty of other institutions of higher education that are exponentially better than Harvard. I'll just give one example. Wright State University, probably not as wealthy as Harvard, I'm not sure anybody is, but they have a campus where all the buildings are connected underground. They have a niche program there where they train people in how to manage personal care attendants when they're going to need to have personal care attendants that they manage as adults. And the bathrooms off the halls in the tunnels underground, which are all wheelchair accessible, are staffed by personal care attendants in the bathrooms. So they're kind of at a level of thinking about that aspect of accessibility that certainly Harvard is not at, and most institutions of higher ed. both of my children toured the top liberal arts colleges in the country, and when I went with them, I asked all the college tour people, what's it like for students with disabilities here? When I was at Williams, the rising junior at Williams said, if I was in a wheelchair, I would not come here. And this is a very wealthy institution. We went to Amherst, which was kind of the same college, and we got a completely different answer at Amherst. So I think the leaders at elite institutions of higher education feel like they do not have to be a leader in disability. They don't have to be a leader in disability studies. They don't have to be a leader in faculty with disabilities. They don't have to be a leader in staff. They don't have to be a leader in students. And as long as they feel that way, we're going to have a problem in terms of second-class citizenship. And we can look at every other constituency that was treated as a second-class citizen in all of these institutions, and the strategies that work for them are the strategies that ultimately are going to work for people with disabilities. We need to make it an issue when we talk about diversity of faculty. We need to make it an issue when we talk about diversity of the student body, and we need to embarrass, it's basically political organizing on campus, we need to embarrass the leadership of the institution so they're motivated to change.
I'll just reflect briefly on the question of data. I think that's one of the fundamental questions, and I think it goes beyond the technical aspects of data collection. You see, there's so much of stigma still attached to disability, to the conception, to persons with disabilities. And we have seen many, many, many instances where parents hide their children and can't blame the parents, you know. It's because of the stigma that they hide. I mean, one need not justify it, one need not condone it, but we have to address the stigma and discrimination addressed or related to disability. We have had instances where, I mean, I have been involved with the program, community-based rehabilitation program in 2003 in an urban setting in Mumbai. We did a door-to-door survey to find out how many children and young people with disabilities were there, and it was just a handful. We thought, come on, this does not conform to existing statistics, prevalence rate that we have. We said, nonetheless, let's start the program. We started, and in that same neighborhood, locality, people started coming forward when they saw that there were services, as you said. So it's a combination of factors. We have to have services initiated, even if they are basic, even if they are limited. We have to simultaneously address stigma and discrimination. There are a lot of ways it's being done all over the world. I want to narrate an interesting incident. I was in the Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh. That it's the largest refugee camp in the world, where about 1 million people facing persecution in Myanmar poured inside Bangladesh in a matter of months. So you can imagine the pressure on services. So I was in a temporary learning space, and among 60 children, there was only one child with disability. So I asked the facilitator that, why is there only one child with a disability? She's told me that, you know, it's very, very dire, the situation. We have not been able to have a survey. We have not been able to use disability questions. Maybe we will be able to do it in the next 3 months. But, you know, I am qualified to teach children with disabilities. I have undergone a course. So if they are here, we can do it. I said, okay, let's ask the children. So I asked the children, hey, do you know around where you live, a small shelter, a tent, do you know of children who have difficulty in seeing or hearing or communicating? Do you know of such children around where you live? And out of the 60 children that were there, 42 of them raised their hands. So, I mean, there are creative ways to do it. We need to be creative. We need to have actions at multiple levels, and often the lack of data is just symptomatic of a much bigger issue which we also need to address simultaneously. Thank you.
I just want to come back to one of the other questions around disability, cultural identity. I think it's worth recognizing that a lot of college students develop a deeper sense of their multiple identities while they're in college. That's part of college. My son is a gender studies major at Pomona College, and he's exploring his queer identity as part of his academic focus, but it's a big part of kind of having that opportunity in higher education to have a deeper sense, not just of your own identity, but other identities, oppression, privilege, all the ways that identities play out in society. So yes, we need to do a better job of integrating disability cultural identity into these broader conversations and recognizing that there are fields like gender studies that might actually be helpful in thinking about how to do that in an interdisciplinary way. And I also just want to acknowledge that there are lots of people like me that acquire a mental illness that will be with them for the rest of their lives while they're in college or graduate school. So we should have a strategy for what happens when our students acquire depression or any number of things for the first time while they're here. What is our strategy to respond? What is our strategy to interact with the family and the kind of circles of support around those students? And I think to a large degree, we're still in the dark ages on that. It seems like lots of institutions of higher ed want to isolate the student, assess how big of a risk they are, and then extract them from the campus until they get their mental health under control. And that is not a very humane or healing way to deal with mental illness on a college campus.
And to end on a positive note, in partial response to Elizabeth, everything is a work in progress, and I won't speak directly to the case school because there's a lot of background on it. But we are seeing the schools move forward incrementally sometimes and with larger bounds other times. So just to speak to, I just teach at the case school, but just to speak to the law school in 15 years, we've gone from having one course on disability to now also having a disabled veterans clinic, a special education clinic. The housing clinic thinks about disability as part of the fair housing. The benefits clinic thinks about disability. There are mental health awareness dates. And what's really nice now, I mean, besides the programming as between centers, is now I will see programming which definitely relates to disability. And nobody bothered reaching out to me because we didn't need to have Stein there for disability. And that's great. That's an evolution. And that's exactly what you want to see. So when I first came to Harvard, the person who ran the law school, who was a Southie with a notebook, no computer, told me in very wise terms, Harvard always gets it right. You may not live to see it, but eventually they'll get it right. And that's what we're hoping for. We are out of time for this panel, so please join me in thanking the lovely panelists. Next, we have our closing remarks from the Judy, and I would also ask my co-chair, Sherry, if she would come up so that we can thank Judy afterwards.
So this has been a very impressive morning. And I think for me, outside of thanking everyone who's put this together and the fantastic work that the presenters put into this, I'm looking at the issue of next steps. I don't work at Harvard. I have no authority over anything. So I'm just going to give what some of my thoughts are. Kind of take what you want and leave the rest, and I hope you can all add into that also. I mean, we look at Harvard. I went to Brooklyn College and to Berkeley, and I was really excited. I was at the School of Public Health, and the year I was there, we beat Harvard. Berkeley was first, and Harvard was second. When I look at Berkeley and Harvard at that period of time, Berkeley was growing an ever-powerful disability community on campus and a disabled students office, which was deeply becoming integrated into work going on the campus. So while Harvard is a very old campus, Berkeley also is an old campus, and issues of accessibility over the years have really diminished at Berkeley because from the physical accessibility perspective, things have gotten better. When I went to the School of Public Health, there were no accessible bathrooms. I had to literally go across the entire campus to the disabled student's office to go to the bathroom. Now, obviously, Harvard and Berkeley, that kind of tension when you're a student is great, but Harvard is a leader, not just domestically, but internationally. And I think Andy, was referencing this. If Harvard really wants to be seen as a leader in the area of inclusion of disabled people into the university, and now I'm not just talking about the issue of students and faculty, although that's really critical. From a pedagogical perspective, Harvard needs to be a leader. And in being a leader, it needs to be a convener. And so this type of meeting today, I think, is fantastic. There are many meetings that go on like this. To me, I think what we need to also be seeing is disability not just as a separate area for discourse, but where disability is being integrated across the work that's going on in convenings like this, in being creative and looking at other kinds of convenings that can happen that are not just also based at Harvard, but where you are bringing universities from around the United States and outside of the United States who are really doing some of the critical work on looking at what needs to happen and what is happening, looking at promising practices, and looking at, because I think that's where we're at right now, we're at promising practices. I also feel that the disability community, students, alumni, faculty, have to become much more demanding. The reality is diversity on many of our university campuses is not happening because the leadership of the universities woke up one morning and said, wow, we recognize we are not diverse like our society, and we are going to step forward and we're going to lead the way. That is not what has happened. And so the absence of the voices of disabled people really, I think, need to move forward. We need, there's complexities because on the college campuses, students come and they go. When you get accepted to Harvard or any university, your goal being there is to learn. Your goal is to graduate. Your goal is to be able to move forward. And yes, you're involved in helping to, some people are involved in helping to set up committees and do work, but those come and go. And when you talk to people on college campuses, the issue of disabled students, groups coming and going is an issue, which is why I don't think it's the disabled students themselves that should be the sole bearers of what's going on. We've talked today about the number of disabled individuals who don't disclose. That is true for alumni. And I think it's really important to look at an alumni like Harvard and really look at who are some of the donors who have relationships to disability, themselves or others in their family, and to begin to get the discourse of what Harvard as an institution wants to be doing to play a leadership role. Getting senior people within the institution to be talking about the importance of diversity, including disability in diversity, is very important. This should not be an issue that's really so sidelined. So I hope that one outcome of today's meeting is obviously a working group that would allow this to move forward. But I really also think there needs to be a meeting with the leadership of the university, with the board of directors, board of trustees, to really address the issue of why is the absence of disability still so prevalent? And yes, you're all doing fantastic work, but one doesn't want to have to worry about when a Tom Hare retires, what's going to happen? When a Michael Stein retires, what's going to happen? Now, both Michael and Sherry are going to be here for a number of years, but on a serious note, Harvard as a leader in other areas is seen and known as a leader because it puts its time and commitment and money forward. Harvard needs to step up. The president of the Ford Foundation, in the last couple of years, as Ford has been moving forward on integrating disability into its work, they are setting up a council for directors of foundations. There was convening in July where heads of foundations were invited. The meeting was called for by Darren Walker, the president, and they're moving forward in that area. That is a real issue and sign of commitment, where the head of a foundation like the Ford Foundation is stepping forward and saying, not only we know that we haven't done what we need to do, and this is what we are beginning to do, but we also want to engage a broader community of donors in this discussion. So I really think at the end of the day, this convening today, to be meaningful and to really reward the people who took the time and energy to bring this forward, legacy is what we need to be able to talk about. So in a 3 to 5 year period of time, what are the goals and objectives that should be coming out of this meeting? Nothing changes quickly. Universities don't change quickly, we know that. But a public display from the leadership of the institution, combined with meetings and discussions with both students, faculty, and alumni, to look at where you are, where you need to go, and how you want to get there, and being proactive about it, playing a role like the Ford Foundation is doing, that's where I think Harvard needs to go. Thank you.
So with that, our program is coming to a close. Thank you, Judy.
Oh, you're welcome. Are you speaking? Nobody else is saying anything?
No.
Oh, sorry.
We're done. That was the highest note that we could end on, the call to action, which I think everybody in this room takes very seriously. So we can't thank you enough for providing those closing remarks very poignantly. We know that people probably have places to be, and our formal program has ended. Again, please, I hope it's okay for me to say this on behalf of Radcliffe, please continue to network, please get to know one another and talk, exchange information. I think the quote came out earlier with regard to together we'll move forward farther. So let's hopefully use this as a legacy in that regard.
And let's all join in a moment in thanking our speakers, panelists, staff, the Radcliffe Institute, our ASL translators, the people doing CART who we don't see that's going out on streaming, all the volunteers and everyone else who have enabled today's event to occur. So please join us. One big thank you.